Well, hello, I'm Chuck, and Brock is here as well, and you are joining us for Generous Theology with Chuck and Brock. And today on Generous Theology, we're going to talk about something that is kind of for some Christians, a controversial issue. It's certainly been a subject of division between Christians. And even Bavinck's language here at times is fairly critical of certain Christians. And yet I think it's fair to say that in this discussion, which is on God's foreknowledge and ideas around middle knowledge and what does that all mean? What is God's omniscience and foreknowledge really mean for human freedom or for predestination? I think even though Bavinck tends to be, he can be fairly critical of certain views, I think he also tries very hard to be fair about where those views come from where they arise, and sort of trying to draw, sort of the map of those things. And in that way, I think he still is very generous. And let's be honest, there are some things about which Christians disagree. And this is one of those areas where there is some disagreement. And so I think it can be difficult to disagree with generosity, but I also think it's very possible to do it. And so I think that's what we're going to try to do today, Brock. You and I think, are going to come down generally on the same side of a lot of these ideas, but and so sort of the other side doesn't necessarily have someone here to say, hey, wait a minute, that's you're creating a straw man or whatever. But I think we'll also try very hard to be generous about these discussions. So starting with foreknowledge, and I don't know, Brock, it's in my own background, growing up in the Reformed tradition my entire life, there always was sort of this divide taught to me about, the predestination or Calvinism versus free will or Arminianism. Now, I think sometimes drawing such a clear, well, there is either predestination or there is free will. That's not careful enough. But we also understand that there are many Christians for whom they're on the other side of that aisle. And in fact, I remember one time I was in it was my senior year in college. I was studying in Washington, D.C. at the American Studies program, which was part of the Christian College Coalition. And I was in a group where we were doing just a little bit of discussion about some things. And I knew that I think in the group, there was a student from Calvin College. There was myself from Dordt College. I think there was someone from Covenant College, which is a Reformed college down in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. I believe there was also someone maybe from Geneva College in Pennsylvania, also a Reformed college. And so most of us I knew from that conversation were, from a Calvinist perspective of one sort or the other, either Dutch or British, perhaps. And so in part of the conversation, I remember saying something like, "Oh yeah, well, there's that heretic Arminius," and one of the fellows in the group, one of my roommates actually, who didn't go to one of those colleges. He went to Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma, and he said to me, Arminius, he's a heretic? Isn't he a good guy? I've heard that name somewhere. Now, he wasn't really into theology, and so I had to kind of explain, well, you might actually think that, we're the heretics here, all the rest of us who are talking. And but it was sort of interesting because I had always sort of grown up with Arminius is like the boogeyman, right? He's the bad guy. He's the whole reason for the canons of Dort, for which the college I went to and my parents taught at was named. It's so it was sort of interesting to have that perspective, even though my friend wasn't quite as, on point with all of his knowledge, but he's like, yeah, Arminius, wait a minute, wasn't he a good guy? So, these are the kinds of issues, right? Because Arminius really was in his concern for trying to understand what omniscience, what God's foreknowledge means, and trying to balance that with a sense of human responsibility for sin, and therefore human free will at some point to either commit sin or not. He just came down on a different side of that issue, and sort of was part of that whole thinking about different types of foreknowledge, perhaps, and perhaps this middle knowledge that we'll talk about. Now, Barak, I know that while you're certainly in a Reformed tradition yourself, I know that you've had a little more background in some other areas of the Christian world, and I'm interested in just sort of how did this issue first get presented to you, even before we get into sort of Bavinck's philosophical discussions and sort of the historical things. I'm interested in, was this an issue that you had to deal with, and even perhaps as part of your your process in becoming who you are today and being a Reformed Christian?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chuck. What a history really is. Chuck, you and I talk about this all the time privately. The colloquial saying is, truth is stranger than fiction. And I think when you look at issues like this, you see that really bears out. And one of you asked how I approached it, and sort of where I'm coming from when I think about these things. Chuck, if I got some clay and started sculpting, and I created a sculpture that was in the shape of a man, and set it right here beside us, and I said to you, Chuck, this is Jesus. Worship Jesus with me. Worship this statue, or else. It would be really easy for our minds to grasp that whatever that statue is, it is not the living God. Oh, my friend, if only the rest of theology was that cut and dry. If only we could conceptualize properly the Lord as he truly is. And that's one of the tragedies of this life, is that, for lack of a better word, I call it white collar heresy, and distinguish it from blue collar heresy. For those who aren't in our culture, in our American culture, typically blue collar crimes are things in which there's some sort of physical altercation or bodily harm is involved between people. And so in those cases, it's often fairly cut and dry to see where harm has occurred and in what way. But then there's another complex of crimes in our culture called white collar crimes. And it's not clear that all of them are even crimes. For example, in the late 1980s and 1990s, there were people who lost a lot of money buying these things called junk bonds, and all that meant was they were buying securities that to many people had an appearance of safety, but in fact, the underlying value of the bonds was in significant danger. So these would be for companies that had difficulty paying the bonds, and there was principal risk. And because of that, people could and would lose money. Now, eventually, some traders actually took it into outright fraud. But the point is, Chuck, is that in a lot of those cases, it was much more difficult to hold people accountable to some sort of legal standard, because where's the crime? I mean, somebody's out money, and that's obviously a bad thing. If you're a retiree and that was your pension or your life's saving, that is a terrible tragedy, and it is clearly a significant loss. But you know, if you're a fat cat bondholder, investor with a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, okay, maybe you don't go to your restaurant in Beverly Hills, this weekend. And so, not trying to minimize this, but Chuck, we've got the same problem in theology. We've got sort of these blue-collar heresies. These are the things that are obvious harms that almost everyone can see. And I say almost everyone because, Chuck, social media has convinced me that there is no heresy that absolutely everyone can see. But with respect to this quote-unquote white-collar heresy, it gets a lot harder. And so when we talk about these issues here, I think we might have to throw about words like heresy, but I would, in trying to think of a generous way and a generous response, probably heresy is best used for very sorts of blue-collar heresies, things that deny, for example, that Jesus rose from the dead, things that deny he had a physical body, for example, things that deny the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, for example. These are classic things that Christians can really see in an immediate sense, that to hold those views really puts them outside of the testimony of the Scriptures. But there's a whole category of white-collar heresies that I think one of the words that I hear people talk about is, heterodoxy. And so the idea with heterodoxy is that it's perhaps a softer word than heresy, and it means something like an irregularity. And I think heterodoxies are there's also an intentionality. So, for example, we have some people who were condemned as heretics, and one of the reasons why they were condemned was because of the vigorousness of their opposition to the church. And then you just have some people who have different beliefs, whether they're scriptural or not. And so may God help us to walk in a wholesome way in this minefield. Now, why do we even do this, Chuck? Why do we even have to, why can't we all just get along, and why can't we just say, well, you say God's this way and I say God's this way? It's probably all good. And here's the thing. Just like I sculpted that statue and said, "Behold your God," and asked you to worship it, and if you were a true follower of Christ, you were horrified. So too, we can sculpt idols of God in our own minds. And depending on the properties that we correctly or incorrectly ascribe to God, that's the big, scary deal. And so this section deals with one of the areas that, for better or worse, sinful humans have the worst, some of the worst difficulties in thinking clearly and biblically about this. Now, Chuck, let us, you and I, off the hook. You and I are not going to solve 500 years worth of dilemmas in just this one discussion session, in just this one section with Herman Bavinck. But at the same point in time, there are some fruits that we can bring here that Professor Bavinck gives us. And let's take advantage of those. Let's present these beautiful categories. Let's talk about the issues. And I think we can do that in a generous way. So that's the backstory behind why these things matter, why we have to be vigilant and yet not too vigilant. Like, there's a tension here. You know, we want to be free from error, but we also recognize that we're just in a cloudy, murky fog of war type situation in this life. So this is where a lot of that's going to manifest. Now, I apologize, Chuck. I didn't get into foreknowledge itself, strictly speaking. We will do that, but I thought we really have to set that up in order for people to understand when we do speak and when we do come to aggressive conclusions about specific positions. In other words, when we say, movement so-and-so is outside of orthodoxy, and this movement over here is our tribe, and that movement over here is not our tribe, but they're still comfortably within a wholesome orthodoxy. People can understand that we mean that in a generous way, and not just in this sort of knife fight, zealotry sort of way. So I'm sorry I didn't go into the foreknowledge there, Chuck, but I just, does that help? And in your own mind, when you talk with people who want to raise the temperature in the room on these issues, how do you talk them down? How do we keep this civil and cordial, respectful and edifying? And, how do we even start to build that out as Christians?
Yeah. It's tough because on the one hand, these issues, even if they are white collar orthodoxy type issues, white collar heresy type issues, can be very important, right? They're very key to how we think about things. And in the Reformed world, this is one of those, right? That basically, if you look at basic, ideas of Reformed teaching, you're going to get into this issue. You're going to get into the fact that we're totally depraved and unable to make our own decisions to choose Christ, and therefore, we believe in limited atonement, right? That there are those who God has chosen and those who God has not, and that's difficult for some people to accept, but it is at the core of Reformed. It's one of the core tenets of Reformed theology. But I think it's important, as you know, that while we may consider them important, and so there is a reason why, as Reformed folks, we are not members of the Roman Catholic Church. We're separated from, certain churches that followed, the teachings of Arminius and people like that. We've set up doctrinal standards that make that clear. It's still possible to say, yes, we believe these things are important, and so we separate ourselves in some ways with our views, and yet we can do that without necessarily believing that anybody who disagrees with us is going to hell. Because also a key tenet of Reformed theology is that we are all sinners alike, and all in the need of the grace of God. And so for us to somehow say, well, yeah, you believe this, you're good. You don't believe this, you're bad. That's not really Reformed theology either, right? We understand that our understanding is imperfect. We understand that perhaps we're even mistaken about some of these things, and so we have to be careful about how strongly we take positions. Now, there is a sense. We had a guest pastor this yesterday at my church. Our pastor went on his regular summer break and is enjoying himself up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But we had a guest pastor, and he made the point, which I think he's correct on, that in today's world, it has become very difficult to disagree. And that's because for many people, disagreement is equivalent to hatred. And, nothing could be further from the truth. You can disagree with someone in love. And in fact, you can disagree with someone and, consider that they're part of the kingdom of God. I often tell the story of a friend of mine. He and I come down on different sides of the divide on homosexual conduct, basically. And I accept my denomination's view that there isn't any homosexual conduct that is legitimate. And so we basically say, no same-sex marriage, that kind of thing. And while and my friend very much disagrees with that. In fact, he himself is in a same-sex marriage. But I think one of the ways that we were able to sort of deal with this sort of elephant in the room about, well, if you disagree with someone, you must hate them. Don't you hate him because you disagree with his, choices? Doesn't he hate you because you're attacking him? No. What was great about that is we had an honest conversation, and I said to him, "Look, this is where I'm at. I might be wrong. I don't think I am at this point. At this point, I haven't been persuaded that I'm wrong. There's a part of me that kind of wishes that I were wrong, but I don't think so. But you know what, my friend, we're going to see each other in heaven, and who knows? Maybe when we get there, you'll be there waiting for me, saying, 'Hey, Chuck, you were wrong about this,' and I'll be like, 'Sorry.' Sorry that I was wrong about that." Or, it could go the other way. And we were able to have that discussion, understanding that while we had different views on what has become a very, very contentious issue right now, a very, very contentious issue in my denomination, that our North American Synod is spending a lot of time talking about this week, that you can have contentious issues and still recognize God's image in the person with whom you disagree, and actually recognize that hey, I think I'm right, but I guess it's possible. Let's hold these things loosely enough to account for God's grace, and I hope we can do that. It's perhaps not as the homosexual issue right now, because it's so much a part of so many denominations are fighting over it and splitting over it. It's a really hard one, I think, for a lot of people. But let's be honest, the issues of divine foreknowledge and predestination and free will, that's where many of us were several hundred years ago, where people were willing to fight over those things. And in fact, to some extent, they did fight, and not just with words, but with swords and guns and uniforms. And, it's really unfortunate. Doesn't mean that these aren't important issues. Doesn't mean that we're not going to hold to these issues strongly, but they are things that we can. I like, you're putting it that way, for white collar heresy. It's not, I don't know. I mean, white collar crime still is crime. People do go to prison for it. So it's maybe an imperfect analogy, but all analogies would be imperfect. And I kind of like it, because I think it does give a sense that there's a difference between denying the divinity of Christ, or denying the presence of a creator God, or denying that God loves people and wants to save them, or denying that sin even exists. There's a difference between that and differences over divine foreknowledge and what that means for how we are saved, and those kinds of issues. So yeah, I like that. I like the analogy for that reason. So I appreciate that. So let's take a look at what Bavinck has to say, and I'm interested in, sort of, since we didn't quite get into how you dealt with these things historically, and if you decide to do that, that's fine too. But I'm interested then in, some of these issues that Bavinck points out, and some of the discussion that he has about various views of foreknowledge and middle knowledge. How have these issues become important for you, and what is it that perhaps based on what Bavinck is saying here in chapter 5, did you find especially interesting, or especially useful, perhaps?
Yeah. Thank you, my friend, for that. And there's actually a nice tie-in to answer your question, because by God's grace, I was saved an Augustinian monergist. And by that, I don't mean that I was saved able to articulate the doctrines maturely in sort of a secondary, tertiary, and quaternary depth. But in my own case, when I heard these broadly Augustinian monergistic positions articulated, something inside me clicked and said, yes, that's it. And that's so important here. So just foreknowledge is one example. Without making this a primary issue, there's still such an important issue about the quality, quantity of God's knowledge, and how he might acquire knowledge or not acquire knowledge compared with humans, that really leads to a lot of different, it sets up the groundwork for the kinds of conclusions you're going to have theologically at a later date. So our position, Professor Bavinck's position, the Augustinian monergistic position, is that in some sense, foreknowledge. So let's just say this, Chuck, who's going to win the Super Bowl this year? I don't know. You don't know. I'm sure you suspect it's going to be the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, I kind of suspect it might be. Although I think my friends to the north and to the west, or to the south and to the west, very much disagree with me. But anyway.
Right. Well, with what we understand about the independence of God, the aseity of God, the fact that God dwells in eternity and not in creation in his special spiritual sense, means that while there is a such thing amongst humans, amongst you, amongst me, as foreknowledge, that's really not the case with God. God lives in the eternal now. If we could ask God the question, God, what time is it now in eternity? The answer might be something along the lines of, it's now. There is no past, there's no present or future. God just dwells in the fullness of being. And so this is why Professor Bavinck cites some of the church fathers who say this. We should no longer speak of God's foreknowledge, but simply of God's knowledge. Whatever is past and future to us is immediately present in his sight. I think that's a citation from Pope Gregory. However the times roll on, with him, God, it is always present. So it is no more difficult for God to be in the past at the same time, for lack of a better word, than he is right now in the present with us. And he is equally present in the future. This year's Super Bowl winner, he is celebrating with them, whoever they are. May it be the Green Bay Packers or the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's my team. But you know, the point is foreknowledge is our accommodated view of it, and God has none of it, in the sense that there's no knowledge to him that is future. There's knowledge to us, of course, that is. There's this temporality. There's the past, the present, the future. You and I are bound by it in ways that God is not. And so because of that, this leads to very interesting situations. And here's the fundamental premise. If God indeed knows all things in advance, if everything is set in concrete from eternity, if there is no longer any room for free and contingent acts, if God knows all things, then what does it mean for you and I to be free? What does it mean for us to be independent, autonomous beings? Issues of control, issues of independence, issues of autonomy come up. And what we see is that thinkers who interact with the scriptures, who do not have God as a divine being living in eternity, and who suppose that God has some sort of foreknowledge that is to some degree conditioned on the timeline, we start to have these debates and these difficulties. We start to have the accusations. How can I be free? If everything is set in stone, then how doesn't that make God the author of evil or the author of sin? And Chuck, like I said, these are 500-year discussions. So neither one of us are going to necessarily solve that tonight. But I think if we survey the space and talk about these issues, we can make some great progress here. Now, in my own mind, like I say, when I heard the Augustinian monergistic position as a young believer, I grabbed onto it, and I was just like, yes, that was what was in my mind, even if I couldn't articulate it, even if I couldn't say what it was. As soon as I heard it, it was click. I've had other Christian friends who've clicked in other ways. And this comes back to that issue we're talking about. Can we have some disagreement on these issues? Was there a click for you, Chuck? If so, what was it like? If not, what was it like? And what is it for folks that you interact with who don't get that same click, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I don't know if I could describe it as a click for me, because, you know, as I've mentioned, I grew up from day one in, you know, in the Reformed world, and so it was part of my very DNA in many ways. You know, now my parents came from outside that tradition, and so perhaps maybe more than some people in my own tradition, some people that I grew up with, you know, I sort of had explained to me some of the differences in a way that maybe was a little more careful. My mom, who to this day, she's very much reformed on these issues, but she has also always been, having grown up in the Roman Catholic Church, she's always very much she's worked very hard to get Reformed believers to see Roman Catholic believers as believers who they're going to be in heaven with. But in the same way, she would also explain, like, this is what I grew up with. This is not what necessarily we believe. So it's not a click like suddenly at some point, that's the way it's going to go for me. Rather, it was more of a sort of just a growing increase in knowledge in these things. And there are some advantages to that. There are some disadvantages to that as well. In that, I don't know that I ever had the opportunity to really, sometimes there's a benefit, I think, to really having to deal with an issue in a way that it's almost like it's new to you, and you really have to kind of come to a decision. And I didn't have that advantage, but I think the flip side to that is the advantage of, I never felt like I had any concern about the belief that I grew up with, right? I never had a sense of like, I don't know, maybe that's wrong. Maybe, that I never had that either. And so I've always been fairly confident on those issues. And that's not true on every single issue, but on this one it is. But that is, given that, certainly there has been an increase in sort of understanding of what that means, right? You would have asked fourth grade me, well, what does it mean that God chooses us, you don't choose God? I would have given a much more elementary answer. Today, frankly, it's probably not that long ago, probably sometime in my adulthood, probably young adulthood, where I still would have probably even said, no, free will isn't a thing. And now I realize that no, what I'm doing by doing that is sort of misunderstanding even our own, or maybe putting too tight a point on our own view of things. That the fact that we believe in predestination, the fact that we believe in divine foreknowledge, that God knew from all eternity who he was going to save, doesn't mean that there isn't free will. And I think Bavinck puts it well. Let me see if I can find it. On sort of 197 into 198, Bavinck said, in sort of making a contrast between Origen, who sort of distinguishes foreknowledge and predestination. He says, on the other hand, there is Augustine, who also wants to maintain both divine foreknowledge and human freedom of will. Yeah, but both of them exist. The religious mind chooses both, confesses both, and confirms both by the faith of piety. But he understands that if God knows something in advance, it is certain to happen as a matter of necessity, or else the whole doctrine of foreknowledge would collapse. If foreknowledge does not foreknow things that are certain to happen, it is nothing at all. He therefore states that the human will, along with human nature and all its decisions, rather than being destroyed by God's foreknowledge, is included in it and posited and maintained by it. For since he foreknows our will, he foreknows whose will it is going to be. There is therefore going to be a will because he has foreknown it. And, now some people, I know a few people who would say to me, well, how is that any different from, sort of a view that divides things? And it is different. But it is a difference to some extent of shading. We recognize as Reformed believers that humans have free will. We also recognize that sin has so destroyed that free will that it takes God's moving us to be able to exercise that will in any way other than our own destruction. And I think that nuance, that careful thinking about it, I think even as a high school or college student, I don't know that I fully understood it. And so it makes me happy, by the way, when we've with my youth group, we've talked through these issues a couple of different times. We went through the canons of Dort. We spent some time sort of in another book that dealt with some of these issues. And it was really neat for me to see some of my students who clearly had a far more developed view of these issues than I did at their age. Makes me kind of proud to know them, because I figure if they're already that far ahead of where I was at 17, imagine where they're going to be when they're 55. So I'm kind of looking forward to the future of the church because of that, even though 40 years from now I probably won't be around, but I can rest in the knowledge that God has got people like these young folks who understand these things. So, but yeah, I mean, so again, to sum up, it's not so much a sudden click for me as it was sort of a growth in understanding in it over time. And frankly, reading through Bavinck is helpful to some of that as well, because he's kind of put it in ways that he carefully sort of talks about where some of the other threads come from. And I think you have to do that to really understand sort of the Reformed distinctives, because if we try to teach our own distinctives in isolation from other views, that maybe at that point there isn't as great of an understanding of the entire concept.
Yeah, I love that. I love that line of discussion. So Chuck, you've said it so well. We've really got diverging branches of a tree here, a tree trunk. We've got Origen on one side, with Pelagius and others. In the early church, we've got Augustine, Jerome, others going down the other side. And there's going to be interesting discussions that come from this. And one of the most interesting ones Professor Bavinck talks about here, and that is the so-called problem of middle knowledge. Now, remember, Chuck, you and I have talked about from our theology, reading the scriptures, there is no distinction in God. So it's the eternal now, and he knows all things equally. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean simply that he knows all things. In addition to knowing all things, he knows all possibilities, all subjunctive states, all conditionals, all would have, could have, might have beens. And when it comes to the Reformation and these issues coming up again, there were a group of Roman Catholics, the Jesuits, who really wanted to they wanted to affirm God's omniscience, but they also wanted to have a strong component for human freedom, something we might today call something close to a libertarian freedom of will. And so here's the fundamental issue, Chuck. How can, just as on the determining side, how is it if God is determining all things, how is it then that he's not the author of sin and evil? Well, on the other side, if the human will is calling the shots, ultimately, if the human will is the gatekeeper, if the divine outcomes hinge on whether or not the human will freely and without necessity opens the door, swings it on its hinges, and walks through it, then how is it then that God can make promises? Chuck, how can God make promises to save you or me if your will or my will might thwart his, or even if somebody else's will might thwart his will. Of what use are his promises? And so these are the kinds of questions that came up. And the Jesuits had this idea. They thought about a universe of contingent events in God's mind. Anybody who watched the Avengers movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe knows that there's that arc in the Avengers, Infinity War, Endgame. There's that plot device where one of the Avengers looks into all of the possible futures, sees 14 million possibilities, and in every single one of those potential timelines, the Avengers lose and evil wins. But there's one of those potential timelines in which the Avengers win. And so that Avenger, in some sense, follows some middle path. And of course, not in exactly the same manner as the Jesuits were proposing, but that gives the intuitive feel. In governing the world, Professor Bavinck talks about them. God makes many possible outcomes that depend upon conditions, and he knows in advance what he will do in the cases where these conditions are or are not fulfilled by humans, and in all cases, therefore, God is ready. He foresees and knows all possibilities in the Jesuits' thinking, and he makes his decisions and his provisions with a view to all of those possibilities. So, Chuck, I just mentioned a moment ago this idea that the future might hinge on whether or not you open that door and walk through that door. And in this middle knowledge, Molinistic, eventually, view, it's covered because God has a determining strategy to accomplish his divine purpose that accommodates the human will in that regard. And so the Jesuits would point into the Bible, and they would say things like God knew in advance what he would do if Adam fell, and also if he did not fall. God knew what would happen to David if he did go to this place while he was chased by King Saul, or if he did not go to that place. God knows what will happen if Tyre and Sidon repents and turns to him, but he also knows what's going to happen if they don't. And so the reality that we live in this sense, stops being a simple timeline with past, present, and future, and starts to be this decision tree of events in histories. And God determines to the degree that humans contingently act freely in their own unique ways, and then God's plan actualizes around that. So these are the kinds of things that people are thinking about. And one of the morals of the story here, Chuck, is beware what you think about God. Because you can see the Origen, Pelagius, Thomistic, Jesuits, eventually the Molinists. You can see that side of the Christian tree going down certain paths in their doctrine of God based upon their a priori philosophical commitments to certain ideas of freedom. And you can see the Augustinian Jerome side, the Pope Gregory side, Gottschalk in through to the Reformation. You can see that other side of the tree, and you can see that it's in some cases you're really presented with these disparate pictures. And so, Chuck, this gets to the meat of why our conversations about these topics can be so difficult. How do you think and react when you're talking with people who are trying to make these distinctions, and maybe we're even having troubles getting the discussion started because internally you realize that you and your friend have such different ideas about who God is?
Yeah, and I don't know that there's a single way, but I can tell you. So I had a friend. I haven't talked to her much in recent years, but she used to go to our church. She married a fellow who was from our denomination, and but she had converted from. She had grown up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and so she had become a Christian later in life after she had met her husband, and she had some concerns about sort of the Reformed view of predestination. But what was useful in having a discussion, and I don't think I ever persuaded her, and I suspect she still holds the same views, although I don't know. She attends a different church now. But I think one of the ways that we were able to talk about these things without getting to, oh, you're a heretic or you're just so wrong about this, was to do what Bavinck does really here at the beginning of his discussion of foreknowledge, and talk about how with God there are no distinctions of time, but for us humans there are, right? And so for someone who grew up in a non-Christian home, Jehovah's Witnesses, a very legalistic, very, only so many people are saying, all that came with that, to then see, to recognize, because in part because of her meeting her now husband, and to sort of become convinced of the truth of the gospel, felt to her like, oh, I was once not chosen because I was not a Christian, and then I was, and that's because I made some changes. I began to understand. Yes, God worked some of that in me, because most, people who are Arminians, it's not that they believe God has nothing to do with any of that, right? It's just that there is a level of human will that is effective, shall we say, whereas we Reformed people would say our human will is not effective to bring us to a saving faith. Well, I'm sure it certainly felt to her like her will was effective, because from sort of the view of, down here in time, it looks like it, right? It feels kind of like that. But does that make sense in in understanding that God is beyond all of that? He's beyond the universe. He doesn't live in time. He created time, but he is outside of it. And if he's truly outside of time, isn't he going to understand and know all that happens within time? And so that's the first place that I have gone, and in a couple of other conversations I've had with people on these issues. That's where I've started. Now, I'm not saying that I've become this great evangelist for the Reformed faith and Reformed views on predestination as a result of that, but I do think that that concept gives gives us the ability to think in a little bit different way about these issues, rather than always thinking them solely from a human perspective. We can, not obviously not perfectly, but we can sort of try to figure out, well, how does God see these things? And that's really what matters. And to a Christian, you say things like, well, God's view of the thing is the important one, right? Oh yeah, absolutely it is. And God created everything, right? Yeah, oh, absolutely. He created time, in fact. He exists outside of time. He's bigger than all that. Yeah. So that means he's going to look at these things differently than we do who are living within them. Yeah. Now, again, that still, I've even have people come so far as to say that both Arminianism and Calvinism are right. I don't know quite how you get there, but one person did once tell me that. He said, well, Calvinism is right from God's perspective and Arminianism is right from the human perspective. So they're both right. So, hey, we're all good. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not quite there either, but I get, maybe that means you're thinking about some of these issues. But yeah, and I think Bavinck does a nice job of starting this discussion by starting there, because I think that's got to be the starting point. And that's why earlier on we talked about a lot of those issues in relation to God's incommunicable attributes as well.
Now, Chuck, I want to throw something out at you, because my friends who are interested in preserving human freedom and to some degree human dignity, as well as defending God's honor, they think, by not embracing a theology that in their mind makes God culpable for sin. I want to just throw out an intuitive example or two as to why I don't emphasize the independence and the autonomy of the creaturely, sinful human will. First of all, I have had the pleasure of seeing friends in my life fall in love. My best friend fell in love with one of my other friends, and I got to see it happen. And it was a beautiful thing. And by the way, the two of them were the last to know. It was the funniest. It was one of those situations where they fell in love with each other, and all of us around them. So they were blissfully unaware of the early stages of their romance and love. But all of us friends around them, we were giggling like schoolgirls. I know that's politically incorrect, but we were giggling like schoolgirls to see them together, because it was so obvious as the nose on our faces that they were in love with each other. And when they finally announced that they were a couple, they thought they were going to surprise us. They were like, they had like the dinner out at the restaurant, and they kind of dinged the glass. We've got an announcement to make, and we know this is catching all of you by surprise, like it's caught us, but so and so and I have fallen in love with each other. And we were all like, finally, what took you so long? And they're like, what? You knew? And we're like, how did you not know? What's my point? God is more than welcome to work in me, independent of my creaturely will, in cases like that. Now, another example of this would be, Chuck, I studied math in college, and because of that, I just don't play lottery games. Lotteries are not my thing. I don't have anything against people who do. But, in one of my classes, we had to calculate the odds of actually winning. We had to do the math, and I did the math. And it took whatever potential enjoyment I might have had from the game away from me. God is more than welcome, Brother Chuck, to force my will into buying a lottery ticket if it's the winning one. And just one more intuitive example. It's the same thing. This is a less happy scenario or situation, but it might be the same thing in a medical emergency. Chuck, heaven forbid you or I or a loved one or a friend was in a medical emergency where they've lost consciousness and they're in a serious situation and they're rushed to the hospital and the doctor looks and assesses their situation and triages their case and say, okay, this is a very serious medical condition. Well, I'm afraid I cannot act because they have not given me their consent. Well, no, we don't think that. The doctor acts because the situation is grave, and he acts within, a fiduciary position. And so, too, we have that sort of situation here between us and God, and far from. I apologize for even using this language, but some of our opponents criticize our Augustinian position as when God saves, when God changes the will without our consent to turn us toward himself and from sin, that's even called by some free will exponents a violation. And the analogy here is the sexual violation of a woman. God cannot save me against my will, some of the most aggressive critics will say. And I'm shocked by that. First of all, what is my will to God that he should be obligated or have a duty to wait on me? And second of all, in these situations where we're talking about, where God goes out and forces me to buy a lottery ticket I would never buy otherwise, and I win $100 billion and split half of it with you, my friend. What there really is, we really have to be. Now, that's an extreme. I respect people who want to guard what they see as an integrity of the freedom of the will. But at the same point in time, it's just not the same priority in my own thinking. And even worse, I ask my friends, both libertarian friends and just people in general, who has your best interest at heart? Who has your best interest at heart? Now, when I first started asking people this, Chuck, I figured, my guess was that perhaps 3 out of 4 people would say something like, I have my best interest at heart. Maybe 1 person out of 4 would say something else. But I figured probably maybe 75% of the people would say, I have my best interest at heart. Chuck, when I asked that question in a very neutral situation, I probably only get maybe 1 person out of 10, maybe 2 persons out of 10 who says, I have my own best interest at heart. And then I'll say to them, well, who has your interests at heart even better than you do? And I'll hear an answer. My mother, my father, my pastor, my best friend, my loved my loved one, my spouse. And this tells me that the human will has its part to play. We're not denying that. But it is not sovereign. And in particular, Chuck, it is not sovereign over God. And we should be wary of theologies where I'm the one wearing the crown and I'm sitting on the throne, and God has to come in to the room and ask for my permission. You know, heaven forbid that it should be that way, my friend. And of course, I'm not saying that all of our opponents' positions turn out to be that, but I just want to carefully minimize this idea that we are sovereign in such a way. So where do you take that, and how do you balance those kinds of things?
Yeah, and one of the things that I would say in that regard is I get that it is difficult for some people to accept. There is a natural tendency to want to believe in human sovereignty. And some of that is because we want to feel in control, right? It's natural to not enjoy, to dislike being out of control in our lives. And I think some people go that way more than others, but we like to be able to control things. And there is a sense in which, at least at some level, having some level of control over our circumstances can be a good thing. But we always have to remember that control that we think that we have, or those things that we've done, we've perhaps made sure to get a good education so that we can get a good job, so that we can provide for our families, and maybe set aside some money and for retirement and things like that. Those are all good things to do. It's good to try to control those things, but even those things that we do are still subject to the sovereignty of God. And that's a hard pill for people to take, because we want to control things, right? It'd be tough for me to suddenly find out that my retirement system funds that I've been putting into my retirement, or my employer has been putting into my retirement now for 28 years, coming up in a couple of weeks, had suddenly disappeared, and it's all gone. But that would still be within God's sovereignty to do. And I hope and pray he doesn't do it. But I think he still does things because he cares for us and loves us, and doesn't purposely hurt us. But sometimes there are things that happen that we just don't understand and are beyond our control. So I get that it's hard to accept giving up some level of control. But in the end, if we really do believe that God is sovereign over all, then we have to understand that any level of sovereignty that we feel we may have is totally subject to God's sovereignty. It's totally below that. And I think that's how we have to think about our being saved as well. Now, for some people, I will say, for some people, that's actually quite a comfort. Someone who really, I think I've run into people who really have a deep understanding of their own sin. My grandmother, I think, really is a good example of that. My grandmother came from a really, really dysfunctional childhood. Lots of just terrible things happening, and then for a long time, she still, she went on her life thinking. I think I've maybe told the story here. I think she believed she was a Christian all along, even though she wasn't doing anything to sort of to show that. And it was only then when confronted by a pastor who said he was going to refuse to baptize her child because she wasn't a Christian, that she then dug into her life. And so then as an older woman, it's interesting how even though she fully, it's interesting how this works. She fully grasped and understood and was thankful for the Reformed doctrine of salvation, because she knew there's no way she was doing it herself. She knew her own depravity. Now, as a result of that, she also used to say things like she did not like when oftentimes in our tradition, in our worship service, we have what's called a confession of sin and assurance of pardon. That's part of the standard liturgy. And with a confession of sin, not only do we confess our own individual sins, but we often talk about depravity, and we often say what worms we are, but then that assurance of pardon is that in all of that, God loves us and provides for those he's chosen. And she didn't always like that. It's not so much the confession part, but the reminder of what worms we were, because she also so much wanted to focus then on the fact that that happened before, and God has saved me, and I'm going to focus on who God wants me to be today. So it was sort of interesting to sometimes have these conversations about certain parts of the Reformed tradition. She just saw, even though I think it was more so than my grandpa, she really adopted and went right for Reformed doctrine on salvation and on a lot of those things, but her perspective on it was a little bit different, having come from where she came from, which is kind of a neat thing. I have a friend who went to church with her for many years. She went to a different church than the one I go to. She lived in this area. Went to a church that is very, maybe recently it's changed, but when she went there, when she was still living, was almost all people who had grown up in the faith, right? And she was an unusual person in that she had become a Christian later in life. And but I remember a friend of mine who I'll be having breakfast with tomorrow, I remember him saying to me, "I'm so glad that I know your grandma, because it's because I know her that I really understand what it means, even for my own self, to come out of sin and into belief, because she so well described that and understood it in a way that only a convert could really understand." So yeah, it's a neat thing, and it's good to be able to talk about it from those different perspectives.
Chuck, that's so beautiful, and it's relevant too, because it affirms in a divinely determined way that people play their part. And I love how Professor Bavinck gives us our answer. He says, the freedom of the will does not consist in indifference, arbitrariness, or chance, but in rational delight. And he says this: the human will, along with its nature, antecedents, and motives, its decisions and consequences, is integrated into the order of causes that is certain to God and embraced by his foreknowledge. Every human decision and act is motivated, rather, by that which precedes it, and in that web of connections with which it is included in the knowledge of God. So to perhaps take an irreverent take, if God's reality is the recipe for a fruit cake, our will is one of the ingredients. just like one of those raisins, or just like one of those currants or nuts that the chef, the baker, adds to his fruitcake. We play our part along with a host of other ingredients coming together in a divinely determined recipe that the baker has absolute understanding of how that recipe will turn out. And the baker does so because he's a master baker. And he has willed that it should come out in that fashion. Chuck, we haven't solved 500 years worth of dilemmas. We've only touched on them really at a high level here. But what a fun and beautiful exercise Professor Bavinck has led us on. Let me throw it over to you, my friend, for some final thoughts and a prayer.
Yeah, it is. It is really fun to think about these things and to talk about them, and and part of the reason it's so fun, I think, is that in talking through these things and thinking through sort of uh, the aspects, what we're really doing in the end is we're thinking about who God is. And this is the God that we worship. This is the God who created us. This is the God who, saves us and wants to be in relationship with us. And so getting to know this God obviously is a great and wonderful thing. So being able to have these discussions is really just a way of even better knowing God. And I think that's a good thing. So yeah, let's close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we praise you. We praise you because you are our creator, our redeemer, our sustainer, our savior. We thank you, God, for who you are. And as we think about these things that in some ways they, to some people they may seem, sort of esoteric, thinking about, well, what is foreknowledge, and what does that mean? How does it relate to your omniscience? So what does it mean for human will? And when we dive into these things, we only come to know you even more. We come to know your greatness. We come to know how great our own sin and guilt is, but how far you've removed that sin and guilt from us. As far as Scripture says, as far as the east is from the west, so far have we removed our sin from us. And we praise you and we thank you for that. And I pray now that as we continue to discuss these things and as others discuss these matters, that we are able to do so in a way that brings honor and glory to your name, not to us, O Lord, but to you may all the glory be. In your name we pray. Amen.